Good evening, everybody, from the three of us, and thank you, Max, for the introduction. Well, the reason we're gathered here really comes out of something called the Report of the Church Buildings Review Group, which came out last September, which was really discussing, and it's 70 pages long to read. I wouldn't recommend it as something little light reading, but there we are. But it draws attention to something that we're going to talk around, and that is the perennial problem of the 9,000 rural churches in England, which are listed. They are listed as being of historic importance. And they have to be etched in against an ever-continuing dwindling in attendance, great swathes of them getting no more than 10 people. And the ever-rising age of the people who go. They all get older and older and older. And the statistics on the decline in the countryside of church-going between 1970 and 2010 is, give or take a few, is 50%. It's huge. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of the report because you'll all go to sleep immediately. But it's a very churchy report. It's very churchy. It's all about committees and bishops and clergy and this, that and the other. And I don't feel there's enough of a lay input there, or enough of an input from people who indeed don't go at all, but which love the idea of an historic church in their village. But at least the Church of England is taking on board the fact that there is a whopping great problem. And takes Norfolk, for instance, that has 600 historic churches. I would have thought 300 are totally unnecessary. It assigns, the report says, well, the decision of what happens must rely with the diocese, adaptation. There's something called festival churches in the diocese of Norwich and of Exeter, where you kind of lock the church door, but you open it at Easter and Christmas. So all that's floating around. But what I found really worried me, there's something really rather supine about the Church of England, because this has now been going on for a very, very long time, this crisis. But there's no urgency, there's no sense you've got to get up and start doing something, start stirring something up. And it doesn't, I think, set it within a wider perspective, or ask those who love them but who certainly don't want to go to them to worship, what sort of contribution they might make in order that they can have them and continue to enjoy them as the heart of the village in sense of memory. There is also, I think, a rather pathetic belief that government will step in and produce a dollop of cash. Well, it won't. And I think that is certainly registered in the fact that the ancient Monuments Division of government has been shut down. Historic England has been created, which after the initial dollop of cash from government has to be self-sufficient financially. In other words, government has totally abandoned any idea that it is responsible at all for maintaining, as it were, a network of buildings which represent the national history. We also know, because it's turned up more than once, the National Trust simply doesn't want to take on churches. So we have a kind of whopping great problem. Now, you may well ask, why am I sitting here and going on about it? Well, I was, as Max said, director of the V&A, and we're going back to the 70s, which was the heritage decade. And I'm proud of what we did then. And although heritage had almost become a kind of dirty word now, kind of dragging back into the past, a lot thanks to Mrs. Thatcher, who referred to us becoming the museum country. It's the only thing I hold against her. Anyway, we did 3 exhibitions. One was called The Destruction of the Country House in 1974, caused an absolute sensation at the time. The second, 1977, Change and Decay, the Future of Our Churches. And the third one, called The Garden, the first exhibition ever staged on the history of the garden in this country. Now, looking at those 3, they sort of sum up a whole swathe of what we care about. Now, the destruction of the country house was a huge success. What it did, and it was staged with a socialist government coming into power who were going to introduce a wealth tax. It took the country house, which could be seen as a divisive social symbol, aristocrats, rich people, grandeur and all the rest of it. It took it out of that and moved it over into culture. I'm sure you all switch on for Downton Abbey, because that's where we've got. There is a cult of the country house studies, preservation of country houses and the rest of it, and there has not been a great country house crisis really without a resolution since 1976 and Mentmore. So that moved that particular range of our heritage into a neutral area. The garden was the same. I mean, that produced garden archaeology, garden history, garden preservation, garden restoration. A whole raft of things came out, and it was neutral territory, because everybody loved. It's a shame we haven't got a glass. I mean, everybody loves gardens. So that achieved its objective. Gardens were listed for the first time by the authorities, government authorities and the rest of it. And the one which I consider was the failure, and it still haunts me, was change and decay, the future of our churches. And that's really what really worries me. It's a subject I returned to in 2007, again when there was a lot in the newspapers about the crisis of all these beautiful historic churches which really were not needed, and what was going to happen. I must have something to drink before I pass out. They don't run to glasses here. Sorry, now I can speak. And what we need to do, the whole of that report is obviously about the church as something for, as a holy place for God and for worshipping. And it doesn't, we want to do the same thing as was done with the historic house and the garden, to move it into a neutral area, so that it becomes something which everybody wants to see preserved and go on in some sort of way. And it's a question of how do we do it. I mean, my conclusion was that really the report should have ended by saying, well, we ought to be proactive. We ought to encourage local communities to come together and see whether they can form a trust. Because after all, the church represents, Simon Jenkins said it's the museum of the poor, but it isn't. It's the museum of the rich. It's full of furnishings, memorials, tombs, stained glass windows. They're all rather costly things. But they're also, it's a total mirror of a community that occupied a particular part of England over many centuries. And I feel sure that if anyone could get it out, as it were, not away from the church, certainly away from the cleric who is there, surely, to impart the word of God, and not spend the entire time battling with all the diocesan authorities about change and adaptation and all the enormous administrative things that now fall their way. So this is really why we're gathered here, and at this point I'm going to hand it to John. He's got one.
Shall I seize a microphone? Hello, good evening. My name's John Goodall. I've already been introduced, and it's a great pleasure to be here this evening. I very much have come to the subject of parish churches as a lover of places and of buildings. The point that Roy was finishing on, that these buildings are history crystallized around us in a most astonishing way. We're standing, of course, on the site of the scaffold where the Oxford martyrs were interrogated. Behind us is the choir in which Edmund Campion laid his criticisms of the Church of England secretly in printed volumes in the 1570s. This is a building itself in the centre of Oxford that speaks of the history of Oxford, its religious descent, but also of the secular forces that have shaped the city. Its position, the great spire, one of the prodigies of 13th century architecture, built by the bishops of Lincoln to illustrate their control over the University of Oxford as it developed and grew. Every parish church is different, but the greatest parish churches truly are history distilled and crystallized. They chart the relationship of a particular building with a locality, and they tell the story of all those associated with the locality and that place. In all sorts of senses, I suppose if my own attitude towards parish churches is we just don't know how lucky we are to have them, and that we love them, but we don't love them nearly as much as we should and as they deserve. They are, to my mind, public buildings. They are not the preserve purely of the clergy. They are the product, as I say, of many different layers of society and history producing these buildings. They're not the preserve of any one group. And that seems to me crucially important because in their cultural form, parish churches also have a quality that allows people who have no belief and those who do believe to join in a common cause to save cultural objects of great value and of great beauty. It's a curious thing that there is, I think, a relationship between the physical well-being of a building and the community that maintains it. It seems to me one of the extraordinary things, indeed, about the report that Roy has already referred to, this idea of festival churches. It seems to me extraordinary, the idea that you should shut up a building of this interest and quality in any village or town. That's not just sentimental, it's also what insurance companies advise churches to do. Keep the doors open. If you have a church with closed doors, people will break into it and feel confident that they will not be disturbed while they rob it. So the idea that you should be shutting up churches in any circumstances at all seems to me both against common sense, but more profoundly against the quality that makes them special. I think also it's important to register a point about the crisis that they are in. I don't disagree with anything Roy has said. There is a crisis, and it's a mounting crisis. But it's also been a crisis that's been predicted for over half a century. In the 1950s, people were predicting a disaster for parish churches. That it hasn't happened shouldn't make us complacent. But it should encourage us that there is something about these buildings that slightly defies the statistics. And we all actually know why that is. It's because when push comes to shove, over and over and over again, communities locally will come up with money and time and labour to save parish churches. That's an extraordinary thing. And that's also important because although it's popular to talk about crisis, I think it's very significant to think also of crisis potentially as a positive thing. Churches and buildings generally only begin to work with people when things go wrong with them. If this church simply existed happily in the centre of Oxford, and the roof magically preserved itself, and the interiors magically swept themselves, nobody would care about it. It would become something you simply pass by and pass through. The fact is, though, that churches do require input. And when churches, in rural churches, when things begin to go badly wrong, the buildings themselves can often be the catalyst that makes a small worshipping community start knocking on the doors of the non-worshipping community and say, help, we need help with something we all love. So, at one level, although I agree there is a crisis, there is also a positive element to crisis. I remember as a small child, there was a lady called Miss Anne in our village who raced around on one of the first ever electric scooters. She was a very old lady in her 90s, and this was in the 1980s. And there was a parish meeting about taking on an enormous debt to restore the parish hall and the church. And she was the most enthusiastic endorser of this enormous debt. And I remember her stopping beside my mother and myself on the village street and saying, "It's wonderful news. We've taken on this enormous debt. It's so important. It does bring the parish together." Well, actually, she was absolutely right. And what I said about churches as physical buildings expressing the health of the communities that serve them is true in that sense. Because when churches are looked after, when they are beautifully maintained, when crises have come and been solved, you can somehow tell that the village has worked and that they have taken pride in their church. Now, I think it's well accepted now that churches in the main can serve many different functions. About 7 years ago, Roy initiated a competition in country life called the Village Church for Village Life Award, which was an attempt to go and visit churches that had installed facilities to allow the interiors to be used for various different functions. In other words, to function as public buildings. And it was a fascinating thing, judging that competition and going around churches and seeing how people did come together to help save these much-loved buildings. Last year, I judged a similar competition being held by the Somerset Churches Trust. And what was extraordinary about it was that what I saw last year showed that what had been exceptional 8 years ago, namely people coming together to create internal furnishings of quality and well suited to and in sympathy with the buildings, has become a commonplace. Now we can take for granted a certain standard of work in parish churches that allows them to be more flexible spaces. And indeed, again, the report that we've just had mentioned by Roy is full of ideas about how churches can be used in many different ways. But what I think is more complicated to grasp is the cultural significance of a church as a public building. And this is where I say that I don't think we love these buildings enough or as much as they deserve. Because the survival of the English parish church is not something that is accidental. If you go to Scotland or Ireland, you can see how parish churches simply were abandoned, chancels demolished. English parish churches, largely because of the Elizabethan settlement and the Victorian restorations of the 19th century, have survived extraordinarily well. They are an anomaly in our towns and villages. What other building regularly has, for example, a 14th century piece of furniture just sitting at the back with hymn books on? That's the case in many, many churches around the country, these chests that were brought in to store documents, or even spaces that continue to serve the broad function they were created to serve over a millennium ago. These buildings are marvellous and astonishing, even anomalous survivors in the very fast-changing world of our towns and villages and cities. But it's very difficult to capture, when you live with objects day to day, why they might genuinely be significant. It never ceases to amaze me that you go to village churches and you find objects which, if they weren't in a church, would undoubtedly be in a museum. But people still put flower arrangements on 14th century tombs. People still fail to realise that a piece of sculpture might be actually unique in a European context. Time and time again, familiarity breeds indifference. And if only people could see these buildings afresh and their contents afresh, they would marvel at them. And often it takes visitors from outside to spot these wonderful things. But also, I think it's important to register that actually we don't know very much about parish churches. Parish churches have garnered a huge literature, much of it aimed at people with a general interest in the subject. But statistically, it's absolutely extraordinary when you begin to understand how little we know about these ancient buildings. Of the 9,000 Grade 1 medieval listed churches that we know exist in England, less than half have plans that have been drawn up of them. And of that total, less than 12 have ever been excavated archaeologically. When you travel around in these buildings, you begin to realise that they are, in fact, the familiar that is almost totally unstudied and unknown. People think that Pevsner's Buildings of England series have actually told us all we need to know about these buildings. But much as I admire that series, those books are lists, they are catalogues of contents, and they're not always complete. So, if we're going to understand these buildings, we also need to invest an enormous amount of time in trying to comprehend and analyse them properly. And that's a very, very tough call, because it requires technical skill and a level of education, a specialist understanding that is not universally available. But as a final point, I also want to come back to this issue of crisis in relationship to this. Because although I think the outlook is not good, I also think it's very important that we acknowledge just how much is being done all the time, silently, by communities up and down the country to maintain and preserve and look after these buildings. Because actually they are anomalous in terms of ownership, and yet nearly everywhere in the country you can still go and get a key for a church, if it's not open already, get in and look at generally well looked after buildings that are silently being maintained by the heroes of the parish church, which are the communities that support them. And as standards of conservation rise, nevertheless, parishes do club together. They do get grant money to restore those frescoes, to look after that tomb, to reorganise the ironwork on the door to the very highest standard. And although there's a crisis going on, that is truly marvellous. And it's important that that's encouraged. And so while there is a crisis, I would also like to say that there is a great deal being achieved. So let's not forget the crisis, but also let's not forget to pat ourselves a little bit on the back at so much that is going on at present in these buildings. Thank you very much.
I come in from a rather different angle, I suppose, which is thinking about the clergy. Part of my job is to help the clergy in their ministerial development. And I can tell you that in the Oxford diocese, which is very rural, parts of Buckinghamshire and Berkshire, they are a long way away from any urban centre, there's an extraordinary amount of activity and interest, concern, preservation, adapting of buildings, imaginative good plans for putting in the basics that you need, which is loos and bathrooms and kitchens and parish rooms and all the rest of it. But there's still an enormous amount of ambivalence about these buildings. And if I can just tease this out a bit, I think it might make for an interesting conversation. See, the building is a sort of problem in the mind of those who feel called to serve God. How many times I've been at meetings and events and heard sermons where people say, well, the church is not the building, it's the people. Which is true on one level, theologically, the body of Christians who are gathered around the Lord's table Sunday by Sunday, that is the church. And yet, it's never as simple as that, is it? The building becomes a place of interaction between what goes on inside sacramentally and the greater world, the institutions of the world, the landscape, the countryside, the village community. And it's actually getting that two-way movement right, which I think is quite difficult. Now, the church, as we know, numbers of churchgoers have been constantly declining over many years in many areas, not universally so. There are places where there is significant church growth, sometimes in the countryside. But on the whole, the picture is of fewer people regularly worshipping in churches. And what this actually means, it's not just that there are fewer people, it means that you don't just lose your centre, you actually also lose your sort of penumbra of people who are kind of cultural Christians, who have a sort of interest in church life, perhaps some knowledge of it, don't terribly want to be committed. I'm thinking about, there used to be quite a lot of sort of atheistic church wardens in the Church of England, who sort of loved the church really and were quite comfortable around it, but just didn't sort of sign up to the Nicene Creed really. And there was a kind of sort of agreement between them and most clergy that was sort of okay. There wasn't any great problem with it. Now the problem is, when your constituency of churchgoers is drawn from a narrower section of society, that kind of dialogue becomes extremely difficult. And what we've seen in recent years, I mean, I don't think I'm telling any secrets now, is that the majority of Church of England candidates for ordination come from the evangelical end of the church. They're born-again believers. They have quite a strong very deep personal conviction about faith and what their role is going to be as ministers. They're going to be missionaries, they're going to be evangelists, they're going to go out and convert other people. And many of them do that with enormous distinction and success. But, of course, it means that they're, generally speaking, people who think their mission only goes one way. You know, we have it, we tell you, you come in. Now, that's not going to make you very sensitive to the kind of stranger who can really illuminate the hidden treasure that you've got inside your parish church. In fact, it might make you think, well, actually, it's an awful bore looking after this building. Why don't we just move out into the local warehouse, because then we can set up our electronic band and our screens and all the other things that we need for contemporary worship. There's always that sort of feeling that the building is the drag on the resources and that you don't really want to get too invested in it because the real gospel, the real mission is happening somewhere else, or could happen somewhere else if only you weren't pulled down by these buildings. And in all of this, there's a kind of lack of historic questioning, which comes naturally to me because I'm interested in history, which is to say, how many country people really were ever that committed as Christians? I mean, life in the country is always different from life in the towns, always has been. Even the early centuries of Christianity, you'd get, Christianity was a very urban religion in its early life. It took centuries and centuries before the country got converted. And even then it only did partially. Wayside shrines, well-dressing in Derbyshire, what's going on exactly? This sort of pagan, old, ancient resonances which are very far from Christian, very sort of semi-baptized. And in a way, though much of that has died out or become of antiquarian interest but not actually lived very much, it does represent the dilemma that the country church has, which is that it's only going to flourish if there's a genuine going in and out between belief and cynicism, half-belief and passionate faith, if actually the same community is sort of on both sides of the fence. And increasingly that's not what we've got at the moment. There's a wonderful book written by a former colleague of mine in Cambridge, Tim Jenkins, called Religion in Everyday English Life. And it tells a story which may be familiar to some of you, of a parish church which the local inhabitants and their forebears have never really attended. They've never gone to church, except perhaps once a year or to a funeral or whatever. But they feel is theirs. And then in come the sort of town dwellers with their second homes and the new missionary-minded vicar. And they fill the church, change it. It becomes a different kind of community altogether. And the non-church-going people who thought it was their church suddenly find it isn't. And they don't know where they are with it. They're suddenly being disenfranchised. And, of course, the town dwellers who come in and set up the Bible studies and the worship bands and all the rest of it don't know about the others because they never knew what they felt about the parish church. They simply see them as a mission field to be brought in by a different way of doing Christianity. So there's very little dialogue between those two groups. And without that kind of dialogue, the kind of initiatives that John's been talking about and that Sir Roy is looking towards is very difficult to make happen. There's a theological crisis, I think, in the Church of England about what faith actually entails and whether one is prepared to have one's certainties disturbed, informed, converted by the outsider, by the person who is actually the object of your mission. Can the object of your mission be a missionary to you? Now, there are models where this actually is accepted and taken for granted much more now than it once was, that people who go into the mission field, as it were, into usually abroad, into other cultures and other faiths, would expect a conversation, a dialogue between faiths as the basic part of what they do. They don't just go to tell the heathen the good news. They go to share, to explore, and to learn. I don't think that the contemporary English clergy have made that movement of conversion towards learning from and being converted by the communities in which they're set. And until that happens, this kind of conversation is going to be quite difficult.